I think the most important thing for the future of this area is restoration of the wetlands. Those wetlands are critical to protecting us from storm surge. But we have lost so much now that we are vulnerable.
The oil and gas industry has been more lethal to the Louisiana coastal zone than the Corps of Engineers ever could have been. The state has been not only unwilling to recognize the linkage between oil and gas and environmental harm, it has opposed anyone who said it.
I think you'll find the 5 panels that we put together today encouraging.
Why isn't the oil industry being asked to pay for the part that they have damaged to the wetlands? Why can't the oil industry fix what they broke, and then we'll have 2 revenue sources and 2 people working at the same time, and it's in their own self-interest because they're going to have pipes out in the Gulf. Anybody?
Anyone want to touch that? There's silence.
People who say this lose their jobs. They lose their teaching responsibilities. They lose their grants. You get your head above the crowd with the oil and gas industry down here, and you feel a lot of heat. I personally feel a lot of heat. I'm not a brave person. I'm just a person who happens to be protected by tenure, and that allows me to say things, and a few others. There are some scientists who are extremely outspoken on this, and I think very brave.
The reason we have wetlands here is because there's been sediment coming down and building a platform for the plants to live on. It's an entirely different system once the plants are there, and that's the system we've lost. We've been building land for 7,000 years, and all of a sudden we're losing 20% in 50 years, and all over the coast, and only where we dredge. With all these canals, you've allowed more seawater to move further inland, and the stressor would be the salt on plants that normally aren't exposed to salt. Cypress trees, for example, could take a brief encounter with a low salinity intrusion, a few parts per thousand, but it would have to be removed quickly. You couldn't have it there for a month. What happens when you put up a spoil bank or change the hydrology is the water stays behind it and can't get out. There have been a lot of private lawsuits to have the oil companies restore an area that the owners of the property felt they didn't have a right to damage. There is one suit that's been filed. It's my understanding that it's about how the oil and gas industry's impacts on wetlands contributed to damages from Katrina.
It's one thing for me to file a lawsuit against every major oil and gas company on the face of the planet that has contributed at least 50% to the wetlands loss. But regardless of the resources that I bring to the table, I am nothing in comparison to the resources that the state of Louisiana could bring to the table.
The political forces in the state of Louisiana are unwilling to ask the oil company to pay their fair share because they're, I presume, afraid the oil companies are going to go away. The pipelines are here. It's not like the oil and gas industry is all of a sudden going to invest in moving all their pipelines to Texas. With few exceptions, they've really moved what they're going to move out of Louisiana, which is their headquarters. Most of the high-paying jobs have moved to Houston. What's left is probably going to have to stay here no matter what we do. There's no way that the oil companies can afford to move it. So for politicians to feel like the oil company will desert us if they criticize them or if they ask them to pay a share of the damage that they caused is really not based in fact. It's based in myth.
When my family got here 200 years ago, I'm sure somebody looked around and said, this seemed like a really good place to settle. There was a good reason for it. We were 90 miles inland, and there was 90 miles worth of terra firma protecting us from the big bad storms that came out of that Gulf of Mexico. Current estimates are for every 2.7 miles of marshland reduces the storm surge by at least 1 foot. If we'd have had that extra 1 million acres of coastal marshland at the time of Katrina, certainly by anyone's estimate, we would not have had the failure of the levee system because frankly the storm surge would have been reduced considerably before it ever reached the waters around New Orleans. So the way my mind works is simply, as I think most Americans do, he who causes the damage should have to pay for it.
There are precedents for doing what needs to be done here in Louisiana. There have been 2 other major industries in this country that have caused so much harm in the past when their practices were acceptable that we've gone back to the industry and say, okay, now you'll pay for the past. It's unfair to ask the American taxpayer to clean up your mess. You clean it up. One of those two programs is the coal industry in Appalachia. And the surface mine restoration program is based on the coal industry cleaning up its past sites, which are horrendous. They wasted Appalachia in very much the same way. And the second is the Superfund, which taxes the chemical industry for toxics, which at the time the act was passed were being discovered all over the country. The cleanups were hellaciously expensive. And it was decided, no, the industry ought to pay for this, not the American taxpayer. There are two ways to get the industry to clean up. The most direct way and the most comprehensive way would be for Congress to pass a law saying, okay, we're going to make saving Louisiana a priority. It's going to cost X billion dollars. We're going to split that right down the middle. We, the taxpayer, will pay for half. You, the industry, will pay for half. And we're imposing a tax on your products to recover that. It's put in a trust. It's used for coastal restoration. That would be the easiest way to do it. But that's not the only way to get the industry. What catalyzed Congress in those cases were private lawsuits that were filed against industries that had left these terrible chemical and coal waste legacies. Those suits started winning, and that created momentum for a larger, more comprehensive solution than going to a trial court and 7 or 8 years later coming out with some money. So private litigation is an option here, and it may catalyze the government to react later on.
Immediately, the oil and gas industry filed motions to dismiss, saying that basically the people of the city of New Orleans and the people of southeast Louisiana did not have the right, did not have what's called legal standing to bring the action, that no duty. Their argument was that there was no duty owed by the oil and gas industry to the people of southeast Louisiana, none whatsoever. The court left the door open to make it a series of smaller cases as opposed to 1 or 2 large cases. What we did was we consulted with the scientists.
A minimum of 29 to 55% of the wetland loss is due to canals and spoil banks. A spoil bank is the deposited material that comes from the dredged canal, and it's piled up as a continuous bank of material on both sides of this canal. When hurricanes come in, they bring salt water in, and it gets trapped behind these spoil banks, and it has a negative effect on the wetlands. They turn to open water. I think you can make an argument it's much higher than 60%. Dredging has risen and fallen over time. It's gone up and down. It's a hump. And land loss has gone up and down over time. It's lagging a few years behind it, but it's a mirror image.
If you talk to the oil and gas experts, they admit that at least 25% of all coastal wetland loss is directly attributable to oil and gas operations. So whether it's 25%, 50%, or frankly, some estimates go as high as 2/3, whatever that percentage is, certainly the people who benefited from those pipeline canals and those access canals, that is the oil and gas industry, should bear the cost of the damages that they caused.
Federal government did not cause all of the wetlands loss in the state of Louisiana. We can yell at them about levees all we want to. Levees are not going to protect us from a 22-foot storm surge. Wetlands are going to protect us from a 22-foot storm surge because they're going to buffer and reduce the level of that surge. Levees should be our last line of defense. And it is unlikely, in my opinion, that the federal government is going to pay for all of the restoration needs and rebuilding needs of this state, which is $20 billion conservatively for wetlands restoration. The state will have to come up with $5 billion. The state's oil revenues will never produce that amount of money. And on top of that, we have no assurance that the federal government is going to fund the $15 billion remaining costs for wetlands restoration. The state needs to start thinking about where it's going to get its revenues. I think they need to call the oil companies in and discuss with them that they have evidence those oil companies are responsible and that they want to negotiate how much the oil companies are willing to come forward with.
In the 60s, everybody knew that these canals were killing marsh. There wasn't any doubt about it. It was just a question of numbers. The idea that, oh, suddenly we woke up in the year 2000 and found out that what we were doing was harmful is patently false. I can point to you any number of special issues of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, of science magazines, of science reports, of expert studies, EPA studies, and they all say these canals are killer.
The United States Army Corps of Engineers, 40 years or more ago, did a study that proved unequivocally that saltwater intrusion killed coastal wetlands, killed the marshlands, killed freshwater estuaries. And that was paid for with public dollars, was publicly available and publicly published, certainly known to the oil and gas industry, and certainly should have been known to the state of Louisiana and the Department of Natural Resources here in the state of Louisiana.
What Gagliana and Doka and the USGS have now concluded, there's an enormous amount of geological faulting under that zone. And that faulting is exacerbated by taking the oil and gas out from under it.
If you pull something out of a void, that something's going to fill the void probably by falling. And, you know, pulling oil out is like pulling water out of something. You leave a void.
The oil and gas industry did everything they could to keep the lid on this information, and they continue to do it today. Look at the state's America Wetlands campaign, run by Shell Oil, and you will not find in that campaign a whisper about oil and gas damage to the zone. It's just taboo.
I mean, think of the irony of that. They're there with the Save the Wetlands campaign, and yet they're the ones that are primarily responsible for most of the damage and loss of the wetlands. There are very few politicians who are willing to cast the stone at the giant, if you will, because of the fear of the retaliation by the giant.
Oil trumps. So getting any Louisiana politician to present the industry the bill would require a change of mind that's just inconceivable here. It's just known through the industry that we're pushovers. I mean, they walk in the door and we roll over. The oil and gas industry is about as close as you get to an economic religion down here. I don't think our congressional delegation is bribed, but if you look who staffs these senators and who staffs these congressmen, these are ex-Corps employees and these are oil and gas employees. And when they leave these jobs, they go directly into the oil and gas industry or into lobbying Congress for more Corps of Engineers projects.
It's either got to come from either the president or the governor of this state. Somebody's got to make that overture. Somebody's got to make the first step. Somebody's got to bring the parties to the table to say, okay, we're going to tackle this problem and everybody's going to bear their fair share of expense.
The network of canals in the Louisiana coastal zone is only partially to access deposits in the zone. It is also largely to provide transportation back and forth for the fluids and for the crews and for the rest of the operation of these offshore rigs. So we've disemboweled ourselves for two reasons. One, to get the oil out of what we own, but secondly, to facilitate the oil or gas on the federal, beyond 3 miles estate.
The offshore oil and gas activity has a role to play in how the wetlands are managed. There's about 200 pipelines that cross from offshore into Louisiana, and they go directly across barrier islands through inlets. So when they cross the land, they dredge a trench. They go through the wetland, and they're constantly joining with other pipes as they go. And then they come to a facility that has to receive it and pump it further on.
We've been bearing the environmental cost. We've had the energy burdens of the country on our shoulders since the early 30s. I mean, look at the number of refineries that line the Mississippi River, right, between Baton Rouge and the mouth of the river. Those refineries represent billions of dollars worth of investment in infrastructure. The only thing that protects those refineries from hurricanes is coastal wetlands. All we're saying is, let us get our fair share as well, both of the costs from the oil and gas industry for the damage that they caused, as well as, frankly, from the OCS revenue. Because the OCS revenue off the coast of Louisiana doesn't go to Louisiana, it goes to the federal government. The federal government claims that the oil and gas off the coast of Louisiana belongs to it, as opposed to belonging to the contiguous state.
90 to 95% of the oil and gas reserves are beyond the state boundary that are in federal water. 90 to 95% of the pumped oil and gas, and 90 to 95% of the future pumping is off Louisiana.
The damages that the pipeline and access canals caused are separate and apart from the inherent value, if you will, of the resource itself. In 1997, $3 billion in that fiscal year was paid in royalties to the federal government for oil and gas extracted off of Louisiana's coast. 100% of it goes to the federal government, none of it comes to the state of Louisiana. Every other state in the country, by the way, goes directly to the state and bypasses the federal government, but it's just the opposite for Louisiana.
OCS pumping is the source of the largest deposits to the U.S. Treasury except for the IRS.
The federal government was not going to give the state the share of revenue they currently are giving us. The only reason they gave it to us is because we claimed that we had damage that they needed to repair. Most states use their oil revenues to pay for education and other things, and we're having to put all that money toward restoration when in fact it'll never cover even the restoration we need.
Okay, from now on, we'll be good boys and we'll pay you more revenues for the damage we caused. That doesn't do it for everything they've caused in the past. It's like robbing your bank and then giving you part of the take. They're still robbing your bank. And they're not taking care of all the past bank robberies for which they've given you nothing. That's the bill that's never been presented to them.
People don't want to hear about blame, but they do want to hear about solutions. But you can't diagnose a problem well like a doctor would without coming to the cause and effect relationships.
I think there's great benefit in the actions that I filed. I'm going to continue to pursue them. It doesn't bother me that I'm suing the oil and gas industry. I'll do whatever I got to do.
The problem is that the system they've left us out there with is so degraded and so collapsing. It's in the emergency room of the hospital right now.
Katrina just confirmed for many the risk, and it confirmed for the insurance companies that we are vulnerable without those wetlands. So it is logical that if you restore the wetlands, create that buffer, businesses and insurance companies are going to feel more comfortable coming back because the risk will be less. So I think it's very possible that New Orleans will be as vibrant and thriving as it ever was